Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. Okay, so overall, this episode kind of has a whole central theme of not judging a book by its cover. Case in point, we have a central group of characters in this episode, and they're kind of interesting, but the mystery kind of revolves around them, and they kind of get framed for a crime they didn't actually commit. So, which is kind of an interesting premise for the story. But in any case, the episode opens up with a group of bikers called the Spankers. Don't ask what, I don't really understand the context of the name, but in any case, the Spankers are just kind of hanging around their roadhouse the roadhouse that they supposedly own / frequent. In any case, the leader of the Spankers, who's just this big, large gentleman with a mustache, he actually walks up to one of the female patrons in the bar and kind of tries to flirt with her, and she's very clearly not interested, but he doesn't know when to take that no means no. So he keeps continuing to try and flirt with her despite her protests. But in any case, it's at this point where we actually meet the titular Wild Brood, and they are, and as their name implies, they are a group of orcs, or rather, this is sort of revealed later, but they're a group of orc cosplayers who kind of just go around and drive on the back of their motorcycles. But in any case, it's at this point where we actually meet Odnar, who is the leader of the orcs, and he comes in, sees the situation, and tells the guy to step off. And the guy and obviously the leader, the Spanker leader, doesn't really understand what he's talking about, what he's looking at. Mainly because obviously, again, Ognar is dressed to the nines in cosplay. He really just kind of commits the whole bit of being this giant brooding orc character. At which point, but in any case, it's at this point where his lieutenant, what is it, Gabtroff, that guy, he walks in and then proceeds to kind of translate for his boss, explaining how Odnar just told him that his kind isn't welcome there, and that if he doesn't want to leave peacefully and stop causing problems, that they'll have to take matters into their own hands. But obviously the Spankers don't really take kindly to that and just laugh them off, and obviously the leader of the Spankers then tells them that it's their territory, and that if they want to go for a rough time, they'd be more than happy to oblige. At which point, Obnar points out that they tried to solve the situation peacefully. At which point the remaining orcs, they all have really weird names that I'll get into later, but basically the remaining orcs, Foog, Dreb, and what the hell's the other one? But in any case, the remaining three orcs, Foog, Dren, and Croft, all come in, and despite having a lot more guys, the Spankers are ultimately beaten senseless, and they get onto their bikes and just run off. At which point, Obnar decides to celebrate by ordering a round for all of his friends, and the barkeep is kind of a little wary of them because he has no idea what's actually going on. But he ultimately asks them if they're going to be staying in the area, but mainly because he wants to know how soon they're going to leave. And Obnar merely tells them that they're actually going to be stopping off in Crystal Cove for a little bit, and with what is it? What the hell's its name? They all have weird names, so I'm just gonna refer to them, this one, that one, and the other one. I think that's gonna make it a little Gabtroff, and that guy. Gabtroff comes in and tells them that it sounds like a very fragile place, but Obnar merely tells him to be nice, and that they're going to, and then they proceed to actually raise a chant. At which point, back in Crystal Cove, it's revealed that the Tiki Hut, the bar that got destroyed in Rise of the Humungonauts, Battle of the Humungonauts, it got repaired in this episode. With Sheriff Stone merely telling Mayor Fred Jones Sr. that was actually a really good idea, and sure enough, Fred Sr. points out that if his Board of Tourism wants another Polynesian style restaurant, that obviously he's going to indulge them. And also, he then proceeds to point out that he also kind of sort of built it so that he could actually give Fred a bit of a hand. Because this is heavily implied in this scene. Fred, this is actually their second date, but Fred is implied to not be very good at picking out places. Obviously, the first place he went for their date was as a trap museum, and obviously they got stuck there. Now he's kind of whiffing their date here as well, because he points out that the only reason they're really there is because they get free refills because his dad owns the place, and Fred Sr. merely puts his head in his hands and points out that it'll be a miracle if he ever has any grandkids out of this. But yeah, this is kind of a little endearing thing. Is that despite the fact that Fred Sr. doesn't really approve of his son's hobbies, namely his mystery solving, obviously because his mystery solving causes a lot of problems for the town in the sense that the town isn't able to actually profit off all the monsters that they find in Unmasked. He does ultimately care for his son's well-being enough to actually help him with his second date. He basically just like, hey son, I want you to come to this place. It'll be fine. Just be yourself and don't worry about it too much. But in case Fred and Daphne are kind of sort of hitting it off as well, based on the fact that they're able to be there and kind of have free refills. But then the rest of the gang actually walks in, which annoys Daphne since she pointed out that she thought it was going to be their own special evening, and we find out through Shaggy that Fred actually invited the rest of them since obviously he thought, hey, we're all friends here, let's all get them together. Even though as Daphne points out, it was supposed to be their special night, and is a little annoyed at Fred for inviting all their friends there. Meanwhile, Shaggy, Scooby, and Velma all sit down at a table, and Shaggy is just happy to be with his two best friends in the whole world, but even puts an arm around both of their shoulders, but Velma points out that he's actually not allowed to do that anymore since they broke up, and proceeds to pick his hand off of her. At which point, the Wild Brood actually rolls into town and decides to actually kind of take a bit of a seat at the bar. Which Fred Sr. points out could be trouble, and tells Sheriff Stone to look into it, which he does after taking another sip of his smoothie, and proceeds to kind of tell the Wild Brood off, telling them that their kind isn't welcome there, and that's obviously because they're not there's an ordinance on monstery things, and obviously since they're dressed like orcs, he tells them that they kind of can't be at the bar, but Ognar actually winds up interjecting with that, pointing out that that obviously he kind of opens up with his big poetic speech, but basically he just climbs onto the table and declares that to not judge them by their appearance, and that it doesn't matter what you look up like on the outside as long as you're a chivalrous person on the inside is more or less what he says here, but. And then also proceeds to point out that obviously that if they can't see past their own petty labels, that they themselves are the monsters. And which kind of moves Daphne a little bit, and she points out that he has a very good way with words. At which point Abnar kind of climbs down from the table and sits on it, and is happy to have met someone who can actually possibly understand him. Which kind of annoys Fred a little bit, since obviously Abnar is despite being an orc. And despite being dressed in orc cosplay, is somehow wooing Daphne off her feet, and obviously this gets Fred's goat, and he merely tries to kind of dissuade this whole situation, and tries to get them to kind of break it off so that he doesn't wind up losing his girlfriend, because we kind of established this at this point, and it's kind of been an increasingly developed part of his character, but Fred is very jealous when anybody tries to flirt with Daphne. It's becoming an increasingly obvious thing with his character. Obviously in the beginning, he didn't care about her, like, at all, but, as the episodes have actually gone on, he has slowly started opening up to his feelings about her, and, sure enough, by this point in the episode, he is very open about the fact that he has feelings for Daphne and is now actively jealous if anybody tries to kind of get between him and her. But in any case, despite that, Daphne actually winds up taking up Agnar's suggestion to come and ride with him. And sure enough, since she wants to get away from Fred, who's being a bit boorish in this episode, she then asks Velma if she would like to join, and she gladly takes the opportunity to join them. And with that, the wild brood and the two girls take off with the guys just being very confused as to what happened. And it's at this point where we actually find out that it's kind of been established as part of their characters, but they're very smart and savvy guys despite outward appearances. The wild brood is shown to not only be very smart but very compassionate as well. Case in point, Agnar pulls out a guitar and starts singing his songs to Daphne, which she just silently admires. Whereas Velma and the other wild broods, especially Foog, the two of them kind of hit it off as well, with them kind of just chatting up malware prevention, with Velma pointing out, and she kind of tries to say his name, but she lets it slip that she's talking about Shaggy. But she points out that, as she puts it, an idiot if an idiot, namely Shaggy, gets into you're gonna have the best malware protection in the world, but it doesn't mean that that's gonna be idiot proof. Basically is what she establishes in this episode. And sure enough, Foog is very openly points out that is indeed a very true point, and she wishes that people would just be more careful. At which point Dren actually winds up getting onto his bike and he can't get it to start. At which point Velma just kind of takes a wrench and fixes it, which winds up impressing the rest of the wild brood. And Foog then proceeds to profess his love for her, asking if she believes in love at first sight, which obviously she points out in his case, no, because he's dressed like an orc. But in case, as they're actually doing that, we find out that there's actually another orc that seems to be wandering around Crystal Cove, and while we don't actually see what orc it is, it proceeds to break into the Crystal Cove Armory, steals a rocket launcher, and then fly tackles the security guard and leaves. And it's implied to also be a particularly smart person as well, because he's able to just hack into the security system, shut off all the cameras, and then steal what he wants and leaves. And it's only because he shuts off the security cameras that the guy knows that something is wrong. He just goes in to investigate and quickly discovers that there's somebody there, and then the dude fly tackles him and leaves, but leaves behind a napkin. In case the next morning, Daphne has since returned to her room and is currently sleeping when the rest of the gang and Sheriff Stone actually come in and decide to ask a few questions. And she's a little confused as to why they're all in her room at such an early hour in the morning, but Sheriff Stone just kind of cuts to the chase, pointing out that he feels that apparently somebody dressed like an orc, one of her wild brood friends, proceeded to break into the Crystal Cove Armory, stole a very dangerous weapon, and is on the loose with it. And Fred, obviously agreeing with Sheriff Stone, believing that it was indeed the wild brood, tries to get her to see if he can get her to implicate Abnar, but Abnar doesn't. She points out that Abnar would never do something like that, and that he's a very kind, and that despite all outward appearances, he's a very kind and sweet person. But Fred isn't particularly convinced. At which point, in order to kind of maybe somewhat clear his name, she and Velma then proceed to point out that they actually went camping them last night and were with them all night, which causes Fred to collapse because he realizes that Daphne was with other guys all night, and his blood pressure can't handle it, and Scooby then goes to check on him. And Sheriff Stone pointing out that since he doesn't seem like he has enough conclusive evidence to bring them in, ultimately decides that he's going to just keep an eye on things for now, and tells them that he's going to be watching them like a hawk, and then goes to leave, but then it's revealed they actually wanders into Daphne's closet and gets hopelessly lost, and that's just a really funny thing. But in case with that, Daphne then declares that they actually have another mystery on their hands, pointing out that now they have to actually figure out a way to actually clear Obnar's name. And sure enough, Velma concurs with him, and even points out that from what her perspective was, they're not very violent people, and proceeds to point out that one of them even gave her a handmade jacket, which causes Shaggy to faint, because obviously she comes home with a homemade jacket that another guy made for her, and yeah, it's implied that Shaggy might not be completely over Velma. So yeah, there's a bit of an interesting character development there. But in any case, with that, they then proceed to go over to the Crystal Cove Armory to go and investigate, and start looking into some things to actually see if they can actually figure out if they can find some sort of clue. And Shaggy ultimately concludes, after seeing the giant hole in the wall, that the orc that clearly attacked the place clearly didn't like doors. That's his main contribution to the episode. He's basically like, I don't think this guy likes doors very much. If he's going to go through and obviously if he's going to go through a brick wall, then obviously he isn't planning on using the door. But yeah, that's ultimately Shaggy's conclusion. He's just like, this guy doesn't seem to like doors very much. That's basically the whole thing he contributes to the mystery. It's kind of great. But in case they then proceed to point out that the Velma then proceeds to point out that if somebody had indeed broken into the place, that obviously there should be some sort of security camera footage to try and pinpoint them. But obviously since he disabled the cameras around the building, that the next best place to look would be somewhere nearby where they can actually still has access to security cameras. And sure enough, they check the gas station across the street, which perfectly captures the crime, but they can't see the guy's face and figure out who it is. But Fred merely points out that he has a very similar looking hat to a certain orc we know. So yeah, for that reason, he then begins to continue to suspect Obnar. But Daphne really merely reasserts her point, pointing out that she doesn't feel like Obnar would do something like that. At which point, Velma actually spies the napkin near where she found the near the fence where the shadowy orc dropped it. That's actually his name, by the way. It's just in the credits, Shadowy Orc. He has no official name, but in case she then picks it up, and after finding out that it is indeed an address to a cafe in Chinatown, which Shaggy openly admits he didn't know was a thing. He didn't even know just Crystal Cove had a Chinatown, much less that there was a cafe in it. They then proceed to go to Crystal Cove's Chinatown to go and investigate, and sure enough, they find the Wild Brood. He's drinking coffee in the local coffee shop with the guy who owns it, Shen. They compliment Shen on his coffee, and he's very happy for the compliment, but also tells them to hurry up and finish their coffee as fast as possible, since they're scaring off customers with their whole orc cosplay shtick. And with that, that's Shen's only really contribution to the episode. After that, he grumbles to himself and leaves. In Chinese, I should mention, we don't actually hear what he actually says, but if you speak Chinese, you probably know what he says. But in any case, it's at this point where Daphne and Fred actually wind up confronting Obnar, and Daphne merely asks him outright if he stole anything from the Crystal Cove Armory, and he just plainly tells them no, which Daphne seems to point out that is more than enough information. But Fred is a little bit more dubious, pointing out that obviously you can't just trust the guy just because you asked him and he said no. But to this point where Daphne actually winds up coming to Obnar's aid, pointing out that she actually points out that obviously that's good enough, since obviously he's a very sweet person, and she again reiterates her point that she doesn't think Obnar would actually break in. At which point Obnar thanks her by calling her fair Daff, and this causes Fred to reach a boiling point, and he then confronts Obnar over it, pointing out that he's the only one who's allowed to call her Daff, and he certainly doesn't add deer to the top of it. At which point, Mr. E, via the computer terminals inside the cafe, decides to interrupt their little bit of bickering, and decides to provide them a much-needed clue to get them back on track. And yeah, it's just a really funny thing. Mr. E is involved in this mystery, but he's mainly involved just to break up their bickering and give them a much needed clue to just kind of lead them in the right direction, and B, get them to stop fighting each other. And it is kind of funny. It's just like, okay, break it up, you nerds. I got a clue for you. And that's basically what his whole contribution to the episode as well. He just shows up. Drops a clue, and then leaves and tells them to stop arguing. It is kind of funny. But in any case, Fred then proceeds to start investigating it, and the rest of the group joins in with the Wild Brood and the rest of the Mystery Inc. trying to figure out what exactly it is they're looking at, and obviously Velma is the first one to figure it out, and immediately figures it out and tries to go off on her own to go and solve it, and sure enough, the rest of the group just kind of continue arguing over what the clue is, and then by the end, they still haven't quite completely figured it out. But Velma quickly figures out that it is actually a dancing swordfish that Mr. E has put on all the monitors, and also notes that there's an IP address on the napkin that she has, and decides that she's going to use that to actually maybe solve the clue. And sure enough, after using the IP address and the word swordfish to hack into the mainframe, she is then immediately abducted by the shadowy orc and dragged off to the back of the restaurant. And Scooby notices this and goes to go investigate, but then he's grabbed by the shadowy orc as well. And by the time the rest of the group actually figures out what the clue is, or at least what they think the clue is, they note that Velma and Scooby are actually gone, and they immediately start panicking and try to look for the two of them. At which point the shadowy orc actually brings them to a cliffside, with Scooby having been strung up by a pulley system over a tree over a cliff, and he then deposits Velma at the base of the tree where Scooby's pulley system is currently situated. At which point the shadowy orc finally reveals himself, and he points out that he actually needs Velma for her very specific set of skills. As he points out, he kind of needs her help to actually reroute a train through Crystal Cove. And she initially refuses until he reveals that he'll drop Scooby off the cliff if she doesn't, and then proceeds to give her a brief demonstration, which she points out is all the convincing she needs. At which point he leaves to go get his laptop and tells her not to go anywhere. At which point Velma points out that the whole situation is ironic. And when Scooby asks her to elaborate, mainly because he doesn't know what the word ironic means, she then proceeds to explain how, ironically enough, it was in any other normal situation, she could just let Scooby be dropped off the cliff, and then she could have Shaggy all to herself. But also points out that she's not going to do that to Scooby, pointing out that she does admire him as a friend, and even though he is the person that ultimately stole her man, as she puts it, she doesn't really hate Scooby anymore, and for that reason she's going to hack into the passwords, hack into the computer system so that Scooby can kind of go walk free, and Scooby kind of thanks her for that sentiment. At which point the shadowy orc comes back and actually snickers at her a little bit for losing her boyfriend to a dog. But she merely tells him to just hurry up and give her the thing that she needs to do her job. And sure enough, he gives her the computer system, and she does successfully route a train through Crystal Cove, which the shadowy orc then proceeds to thank her for by dropping her off the cliff, by pushing her off the cliff. And if it wasn't for Scooby grabbing onto her, she probably would have fallen. But and also they get a little bit lucky here because the branch that's holding Scooby up actually winds up breaking, and they wind up hitting another branch out further down the cliff, which just kind of catapults them up to the cliff face. But and Scooby just kind of concludes that they should probably just go home. So yeah, they ultimately, all of that long-winded nonsense out of the way, they kind of get a little bit lucky with that situation, because if they hadn't landed on that branch, they probably would have gone over the cliff and died. So yeah, the shadowy orc is a little bit brutal, but in any case, after that little situation, they then proceed to go to the Crystal Cove Police Department to tell Sheriff Bronsonstone what happened to them. At which point they meet the rest of the gang, and to Velma's horror, the Wild Brood are now all in prison. So at which point Sheriff Stone actually reveals why he did it, which is that according to himself, he didn't have a particularly good reason. He just was convinced that the Wild Brood had kidnapped her, and he ultimately pointed out that he didn't really have a strong reason. He just kind of booked them over the fact that they were in some sort of strange coffee shop, and that was really the only thing he could really get them on. So. Yeah, but Velma then proceeds to explain what exactly happens, and that and when she points out that she actually figured out the code, which she actually corrects Daphne, pointing out that the code was swordfish. She then also proceeds to point out that that the Wild Brood are innocent since she just met with the Shadowy Orc, and proceeds to point out that it wasn't any one of the guys currently in the prison. At which point Obnar concludes that there's likely an imposter loose in town trying to frame them, and then proceeds to reveal what the word swordfish is actually relating to, and reveals that swordfish is actually the name of an experimental video game console that hasn't been released to the public yet. And when Daphne asks Obnar how he knows that, he then reveals that they're the ones that the Wild Brood are actually the ones that designed it, and then proceed to unmask themselves. Not so obviously, because they're obviously in orc cosplay, but the five of them then proceed to unmask themselves to reveal that they're just video game programmers. They're not like big intimidating orcs or big intimidating dudes. In fact, inside their costume, they're actually very scrawny, but they then point out that they actually dress up as orc bikers to both kind of make themselves look more intimidating and get a little bit more respect, and B, to just kind of blow off steam, since obviously video game programming people don't really know this all that well, but video game programming is often a very taxing job, despite the fact that you kind of don't really see much of that. It is a very labor intensive job, and to kind of blow off steam, they at the end of the workday, they just kind of dress up in orc cosplay and just drive around on their motorcycles to just kind of look like a cool biker gang, and that's their way of decompressing. And sure enough, Obnar even concludes that the reason they dress up as orcs is just to kind of is because it gives them a little bit more respect. Obviously they're all nerds, and sure enough, all of their, with the exception of Obnar, who is a reference to Marlon Brando from The Wild Ones, but all of the other biker gangs, and this is why they have such weird names, is that all of the other bikers, all of their cosplay names are derogatory terms backwards. Dren is nerd. Gaftron is fartbag. Dren is and then Foog is goof, and what is it? And then I think what is it? Karat is dork. Yeah, all five of them have all four of the five have very derogatory names backwards. So yeah, that kind of plays into the whole big twist that they're actually video game nerds, because they name themselves after the whole video game nerd thing that they are. They are nerds, and their names reflect them as such. But in any case, after remasking, Dren declares that they're going to have to catch the imposter, and Ognar agrees, and points out that since there's a train since they now know that the train is actually going through Crystal Cove, points out that they're actually going to have to move in and go catch it, and Fred merely declares that they have a train to catch, at which point Sheriff Stone off-screen lets the Wild Brood out, and the Mystery Inc. gang in the Mystery Machine, as well as the Wild Brood on the motorcycles, then proceed to chase down the road to actually find the train going through Crystal Cove, and they do eventually find it, and with some very clever driving from Fred, he winds up driving it off the cliff and landing on the train, with the rest of the Wild Brood actually landing on the train next to them, Ognar compliments Fred on his driving and calls him Frederick, which he then points out that it's just Fred, and he even points out that they call him Freddy unless they're dating. But he only points out that only people who liked him or call him Freddy are people who are actively interested in him. But in case with that, Obnar then proceeds to mobilize the rest of the group, which Fred admits he wanted to say, and in any case, the 10 of them then proceed to go through the train to actually try and figure out what's going on. And sure enough, they find out that several of the security guards have actually been knocked unconscious, and concluding that the shadowy orc is probably further in the train, continue to go through it. And at one point, they actually come across a video game console in its display case, and admittedly, it is a very shiny console, and Shaggy even admits as such. And when he sees it, but Ognar dissuades him from actually tampering with it, and proceeds to point out that there's the two giant ass laser cannons that as he puts it, are brain melting variety. So Shaggy and ultimately dissuades Shaggy from actually tampering with it. And Shaggy points out that that's good advice, and he and Scooby leave. But in case they eventually get to the engine room, where they discover that the engineer is unconscious as well, and concluding that that the shadowy orc was likely just there, start to look around for him, and Fred eventually pokes his head out of the door, and eventually sees that the shadowy orc is on top of the train, and concluding and pointing out that he can handle it himself. He then proceeds to close the door to the train, and proceeds to climb up the ladder to the top of the locomotive, where he's too late to actually stop the shadowy orc from blowing up the bridge, but he does give the shadowy orc a bit of a run for its money and starts fighting it. And the shadowy, and eventually Ognar shows up and gives him some support, and between the two of them, they eventually manage to overpower the shadowy orc and proceed to restrain him. Meanwhile, Valma realizes that they actually need to stop the train because the bridge is now broken, and they actually need to stop it from going over. So she tells Foog to actually stop the train and pull the lever, but Foog apparently doesn't know his own strength, which is ironic considering who he is under the mask. But he actually winds up breaking the brake by accident, and concluding that they're no longer going to be able to stop the locomotive the normal way, proceed to leave the front of the train and climb into one of the passenger cars, and at which point Ognar proceeds to break the lock on that holding the train to the front of the locomotive, and sure enough, the locomotive then goes over, and with both Fred and himself and his own combined strength, the two of them then proceed to stop the train using the emergency brake. And sure enough, the front of the locomotive goes over, but the rest of the train does not, and they wind up saving the video game console. And at which point they decide to actually unmask the shadowy orc to try and figure out who's causing problems and giving the wild brute a bad name. And it's at this point where they unmask him to reveal another video game nerd that they don't recognize. Sure enough, the Mystery Inc. gang don't know who this guy is, but Ognar and the rest of the wild brood know very well who this guy is, and reveal that his name is actually Maxwell, and that he actually works at their video game company as a copy boy. And sure enough, Maxwell then proceeds to reveal his entire backstory, which is kind of interesting and a little bit funny. But basically, all he points out is that he is not one of the game programmers. He was never allowed to be the quote unquote cool guy. So, in order to kind of get revenge on them, he created his own. In what he admits is simple, but in actuality is not. He creates his own wild brute costume. Hacks into the security system at the Crystal Cove Armory, steals the rocket launcher, then proceeds to kidnap somebody who knows how to hack it, who knows how to reroute train wraps, i.e. Velma. And then once he actually boarded the train, he then proceeds to blow up the bridge, which would have caused the train to go over and take the video game console with it. And it's at this point where he points out that hopefully maybe he would be able to actually put the rest of the group out of business and get his own gaming career off the ground, which even Shaggy admits is complicated and a little bit stupid. And if Shaggy is calling you out for something, you know it's a little bit dumb. But in case he then professes that it might have worked if it hadn't been for those middling kids, but they merely correct him that Maxwell's plan would have never have worked, and that's because that's not how game design works. If you sabotage the company you work at, you're not gonna be doing very well. You're not gonna gross enough money to actually leave and go create your own independent studio. So yeah, his plan was doomed to fail from the start. But in any case, it's at this point where they then proceed to bring in Sheriff Stone, who arrests Maxwell, but also makes him remask because, as he points out, that these nerds creep him out. So he just kind of tells him to remask and drive off. At which point, Daphne compliments Fred on being so brave, but Fred merely points out that he didn't really do all that much, and that Obnar was ultimately the one who was the real hero, and proceeds to tell her that if she wants to be with Adnar, that she has his full permission. And at which point, Adnar does greet Daphne one last time and asks her if she would like to go on a one last ride with him, pointing out that they're going to be leaving Crystal Cove in the morning, so she might as well take the opportunity. But she merely turns him down, pointing out that even though he is a very fun and compassionate guy, that ultimately her heart belongs to Fred, and then proceeds to kiss Fred on the cheek, which of course causes Fred to be completely over the moon, and the episode ends with him very openly celebrating and rubbing Abnar's nose in it. So yeah, this episode is kind of interesting and cute in that the Wild Brood aren't really the bad guys in this episode, but they look like they should be because they wear a full costume, and that's normally something that only monsters do in these episodes. So obviously they're neatly framed for it, but yeah, they're not bad people. In fact, they're not even biker gangsters. They're just nerds that like to dress up in cosplay and look cool. And I'm not going to deny it. It kind of works. But, yeah, but ultimately it does enable them to actually go out and show that it's ultimately what's on the inside that counts, which is that despite being these big scary gangster dudes, they're actually very kind, compassionate people, and are more than willing to come to the aid of a lady. And I kind of like it for that. It's kind of like a don't judge the book by its cover kind of thing, where they dress up as orcs, they look scary and intimidating, but in actuality they're not, and then they unmask, and it's revealed that even though they're orcs on the inside they're just computer nerds, and that's why they're not very well received because of that. But yeah, I do kind of like the idea of this episode, and that the Wild Brood aren't really the bad guys. They look like it, and in a normal situation with this series, they probably would be, but they're not, and I kind of like it. I kind of like the message behind that. But in any case, that is my review of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does really help me out, and you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that I'm always saying thanks. So be sure to check those out. Link is down in the description. And finally, if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one. Whereas above, at least the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!